It begins with a simple question, one that threads quietly through the stories we tell about ourselves. How does a single decision made in a single moment ripple outward until it reshapes the world around us? History is full of sweeping movements and slow arcs of change, but just as often, transformation arrives because one person took a step that no one else thought to take or dared to take. Sometimes it was an accident, sometimes it was ambition, teamwork. Sometimes it was a moment of carelessness that no one could unwind. Yet each time, the consequences reached farther than anyone expected. Imagine a long corridor lined with doors, each marked with a year, a place, a name. Behind every door is a story about something that once seemed ordinary. A cave open to hikers, shoes worn casually through airport terminals, a cheerful game show, a generous return policy, a festive balloon release over a public square. Many of these scenes began as celebrations of progress, curiosity, or community. None were meant to carry a warning. But then came the moment, the wrong turn, the impulsive act, the overlooked detail, that shifted everything. When the door closes again, the world on the other side is no longer the same. This documentary follows 15 such stories, tracing how individual choices echoed into bans, reforms, and irreversible changes. The pattern is not about blame. These moments aren't moral fables. They are glimpses into how fragile modern systems can be, how a small breach in a fence can expose the vulnerabilities of a nuclear plant, how a forgotten weather pattern can turn a record-breaking fundraiser into a tragedy, how a single email can alter the etiquette of digital communication for generations. Each story stands on its own, but together they describe a landscape defined not by catastrophe, but by human fallibility and human adaptation. To frame the journey, picture a map of the last century and a half, dots scattered from Utah to Ohio, from New York to Florida, from quiet laboratories to roaring stadiums. These dots are not the centers of major historical events. They are edges, fringes, places where ordinary routines collided with unforeseen consequences. A spelunker searching for a narrow passage, a vlogger exploring for views, a cook unaware she carried illness inside her, a teenager who believed he would never face a consequence, a chemist whose brilliant solutions carried hidden costs on a global scale. We return to these moments not to sensationalize them, but to understand the anatomy of unintended impact. It is easy to imagine that lasting change comes from grand speeches, sweeping legislation, or monumental discoveries. Yet the world often pivots because of something much smaller. A misread label, a gap in a fence, a misplaced conviction, a single spark thrown into the machinery of everyday life. These stories remind us that history is not shaped only by heroes and institutions. It is shaped just as profoundly by the unpredictable paths of ordinary people. And so this prologue asks a simple question that will guide the chapters ahead. What do we learn when we trace the boundaries between action and consequence? What does it reveal about our desire for order, our attempts to safeguard the future, our hope that we can make systems foolproof in a world where no system can ever fully account for human behavior? As we step into the first chapter, keep that feeling in mind, the quiet moment before something shifts, the breath before the pattern bends. Because each story that follows begins the same way, with a person, a choice, and a world that never quite expected what would happen next. It started as a family tradition, a simple Thanksgiving trip back home. On a cold November day in 2009, John Edward Jones, medical student, father, and former Boy Scout, entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah with his brother and a group of friends. The cave had a reputation: narrow, clay-lined passages, winding crevices, and a past dotted with rescues. But it had recently reopened under new rules after being shut down for safety concerns. All seemed in order, all seemed manageable. John was searching for a route called the birth canal, a tight, familiar squeeze. But in the silent dark beneath the earth, disorientation is easy. He wriggled into the wrong passage, a jagged fissure only 10 inches high and 18 inches wide. As he moved forward head first, gravity and biology conspired against him. His chest compressed as he exhaled, allowing him to inch deeper. But when he inhaled, his lungs expanded, locking him in. He was trapped, 150 feet below the surface, upside down, with nowhere to turn. What followed was a desperate and heroic effort to save him. Over 100 rescuers worked through the night, threading ropes and pulleys through the unstable rock. They drilled anchors into the soft clay. At one point, they succeeded in pulling him a few feet backward. Hope sparked in the darkness. But the cave was unforgiving. One of the anchors failed. A rescuer was injured, and John, already hanging at a deadly angle, fell deeper. The human body is not meant to be inverted for long. Blood pooled in his head, organs strained under the pressure. Every hour passed with a cost. After 28 hours, with no viable path to extraction and his body failing, John Jones was declared dead. His remains, irretrievable, still rest where he fell. In the days that followed, officials made a decision that would echo permanently through Utah's caving community. Nutty Putty Cave, once a rite of passage for local adventurers, was sealed with concrete, not as punishment, but as a memorial. John's tomb became the end of access for everyone. The cave was closed forever, not out of blame, but out of necessity. Caving is one of the few modern adventures that still carries an ancient danger. It demands humility before nature's architecture. A single wrong choice, 1 foot too far, 1 turn misjudged, can change everything. John didn't enter that cave with recklessness. He was cautious, experienced, and surrounded by people who loved him. But caves do not care about credentials. What we're left with is not just a story of tragedy, but a meditation on risk and reverence. Nutty Putty is now a place no one will ever visit again, a site remembered not for its challenge, but for the life it claimed, a space made sacred through sorrow. So we ask, how do we decide when a space, a tradition, or a freedom must be surrendered? Not because of a rule broken, but because the margin for error proved too narrow. And when we close a door forever, do we do so to protect the living or to remember the dead? It was December 2001, and the world was still holding its breath. The memory of September was fresh, too fresh. Airports were tense, security heightened, suspicion in the air like static. Amid this fragile new normal, one man stepped into an airport in Paris carrying something that would never detonate, yet would alter the course of global travel forever. Richard Reed did not look like a mastermind. Disheveled, alone, no checked luggage, and a ticket paid for in cash, he set off every red flag. Pulled aside for screening, questioned for hours, and denied boarding, Reed was given a second chance most never get. Come back tomorrow. And he did. The next day, Reed returned wearing the same shoes, now packed with PETN, a powerful explosive. He boarded the plane to Miami. Mid-flight, passengers noticed a strange smell. A flight attendant found Reed hunched over, trying to light a fuse dangling from his sneaker. The attempt failed. The sweat from the previous day had dampened the fuse. He tried again. She lunged, grabbing his arm. He bit her. Others joined the struggle, forcing him down. A 6'4" man helped pin Reed. Belts and cords restrained him. Doctors aboard sedated him. The passengers had stopped what security had missed. The bomb never went off. But that didn't matter, because the image, the possibility, was enough. A man nearly blew up a plane with his shoe. That alone rewrote the rules. Overnight, billions of people lost a small, invisible freedom, the right to walk casually through an airport. Now, shoes must come off. Feet shuffle across cold tiles. Children and elders stand awkwardly, balancing. For one man's failure, a ritual was born. What's remarkable is not just the act, but how unimpressive it was. Reed was not brilliant. His device was crude. Investigators found hairs and prints on the bomb that weren't even his. He was a pawn, a messenger with sweaty feet and bad timing. And yet, through a collision of bad luck and worse oversight, he became the lever that tilted an industry. Security is theater, some say, but that underestimates what these gestures actually are. They are rituals, reminders etched into our habits. Take off your shoes, pour out your water, empty your pockets. We obey, not because it always makes sense, but because the memory of what might have happened still hums beneath the surface. Richard Reed didn't kill anyone. He didn't succeed. But the shadow of what could have been was more than enough. And in that shadow, airports around the world rewrote their choreography. So here's the question. In our quest for safety, how much of our freedom do we trade for the illusion of control? And when the threat fades, do we ever get back what we gave away? The lights were bright, the music playful, and the crowd buzzing with excitement. For over 3 decades, The Price is Right had been a comforting constant, colorful, cheerful, and reliably unscripted. But on one peculiar day in 2008, something happened that would rattle the very foundations of the show. A contestant named Terry Knies stood at the final showcase. He listened calmly as the prizes were revealed: a karaoke machine, a pool table, a camper. Then he bid $23,743. When host Drew Carey revealed the actual retail price, it was an exact match, down to the dollar. A perfect bid. The crowd exploded, but Carey didn't smile. The joy turned to confusion. Cameras stopped. Producers rushed the stage. In a show where prices could come within hundreds, even a few dollars, no one had ever guessed with surgical precision. The fear was instant. Someone had cheated, but Terry Knies hadn't pulled a fast one. The real story was in the audience. There sat Ted Slauson, a lifelong fan, a man obsessed with the game. For decades, he had recorded every episode, logging every product, memorizing each price. The show, it turned out, was lazy. Prices recycled, prices reused. Ted built a database in his mind and attended tapings regularly, whispering the exact numbers from the crowd. That day, Terry had simply followed Ted's signals. 3 fingers for $23,000, then $743. The perfect bid was a team effort born from obsession, not fraud. The producers were stunned. They hadn't been hacked. They'd been outplayed, exposed by their own repetition. The illusion of spontaneity had been cracked open by one man's meticulous devotion. The fallout was immediate and subtle. Producers revamped the show. Prizes were diversified. Vendors changed. Price lists adjusted. They started tweaking numbers, adding a few dollars here, subtracting there, just enough to blur the pattern. The Price is Right would never again be that predictable. The move wasn't punitive. It was evolutionary. The game had to adapt to survive its most passionate fans. But deeper still, the story speaks to a quiet human truth, that our systems, our entertainments, even our sense of fairness, rely on a delicate balance. Too much transparency, and the magic collapses. Too much randomness, and trust disappears. Somewhere in between is the space where wonder and strategy coexist. So here's the reflection. When we build systems for mass participation, games, policies, traditions, what happens when someone knows them too well? At what point does mastery become disruption? And how do we preserve joy in a world where everything can be measured, tracked, and outsmarted? It was meant to be beautiful. On a late September afternoon in 1986, the skies above Cleveland, Ohio, transformed into a vibrant sea of color. 1.5 million balloons, helium-filled, hand-tied, and carefully packed under a mesh canopy, were released all at once in a Guinness World Record attempt dubbed Balloon Fest '86. It was supposed to be a moment of joy, of civic pride, a fundraiser for the United Way. For a few seconds, it was. Children pointed skyward. Photographers snapped what looked like a surreal dreamscape, an entire sky boiling with color. But then the weather shifted. A cold front swept through with wind and rain. Instead of floating off gently into the sky, the balloons bounced, hovered, and began to fall. Latex rained from the sky. Roads were blanketed. Traffic stopped. Accidents piled up. Balloons swarmed a nearby airport, forcing a runway closure. But the true disaster was unfolding on Lake Erie. Earlier that day, two fishermen, Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer, had gone missing on the water. As the balloon cloud descended on the lake, it formed an undulating mass so thick and chaotic that the U.S. Coast Guard couldn't see the surface. They searched, but it was impossible to distinguish between a balloon and a human head. The rescue was called off. The bodies washed ashore days later. What was meant as a joyous record had become a surreal and deadly mistake. In the days and weeks that followed, the lawsuits came. The wives of the drowned men sued for wrongful death. A local horse breeder sued after her animals were spooked by the deluge of color, ran into a fence, and were permanently injured. The fundraiser cost more than it raised, and something far greater was lost, the innocence of spectacle. Today, mass balloon releases are banned in dozens of states and cities. What once symbolized celebration is now a recognized ecological and safety hazard. The legacy of that afternoon is a cautionary tale etched into environmental regulations and safety codes. It's easy to marvel at the scale of the moment, 1.5 million pieces of latex floating toward the heavens. But it's harder to confront what it revealed. That wonder, unchecked by foresight, can become destruction. So here's the reflection. How do we weigh beauty against consequence? When does spectacle cross the line into negligence? And in our desire to break records, make headlines, or paint the sky with dreams, how often do we forget to look down at the lives below? The fence had a hole. That's how it started. In 2019, a vlogger named Marcus Thompson, an urban explorer chasing footage for a tiny YouTube audience, found his way through a forgotten gap in the outer barrier of the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant in Ohio. This wasn't an abandoned relic of the past. It was an active facility, part of the nation's critical infrastructure. And he walked in like it was an open park. No high-tech tools, no sophisticated plan. Just an open gate and curiosity. For 5 hours, Marcus wandered freely through the outer zones of the plant, areas known in the industry as owner-controlled. He filmed power lines, warning signs, maintenance buildings. He passed silent alarms. No one came. No guards. No questions. He live-streamed from within feet of buildings that, if breached further, could trigger a national emergency. Eventually, as he exited the same way he entered, a security guard happened to spot him. Only then was he stopped. When plant leadership reviewed his footage, the panic wasn't about trespassing. It was about exposure. A single man with a camera had just demonstrated how porous the plant's defenses really were. The footage made it clear the threat wasn't hypothetical. It had walked straight in, filmed everything, and walked right back out. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission launched an emergency inspection. What followed was not just a plant-wide reckoning, but a national one. Every nuclear facility in the United States was ordered to re-evaluate its security zones, their perimeter integrity, their real-time threat response. The assumption that low-risk areas posed no danger had been shattered. Marcus Thompson didn't carry a weapon. He wasn't part of a group. He didn't intend harm. But in a world increasingly shaped by visibility, his footage did something terrifying. It revealed the illusion of control. In the months after, new protocols were quietly implemented. Fences fortified, patrols increased, alarms recalibrated. The nuclear industry, worth billions, was forced to admit that it had missed something obvious. All because a man with a camera walked through a hole that shouldn't have been there. This isn't a story about crime. It's about fragility, about how even our most secure systems are only as strong as their most overlooked detail, about how in the age of digital transparency, a single video can pierce the armor of institutional confidence. So here's the question: how much security is real and how much is comfort? And when the truth is exposed not by an enemy, but by a tourist with a tripod, what does that say about the walls we trust to protect us? Under the blinding lights of a packed stadium, the crowd roared with joy. A touchdown, the energy spiked, and then came the move that had become a favorite celebration in the NFL, a towering tight end leaping up and slamming the ball over the goalpost crossbar. It was part ritual, part performance. It was pure joy. And then Jimmy Graham took it too far. The 6'7" tight end for the New Orleans Saints didn't just dunk the football. He treated the goalpost like a challenge. With each touchdown, he would leap, hang, and violently shake the entire structure. It became his signature. But it wasn't just a spectacle. It was a problem. Goalposts aren't just metal decorations. They're precision-balanced structures calibrated and aligned for regulation games. And during a 20-team primetime game against the Falcons, Graham's celebration bent the post. The game ground to a halt. Stadium crews rushed out with ladders and levels, working frantically as national television cameras awkwardly lingered. The delay? 20 minutes. In football time, an eternity. To fans, it was a momentary hiccup. To the league, it was an economic disaster. Broadcast schedules are timed to the second. Advertisers pay millions for perfectly placed commercial slots. A 20-minute delay isn't just annoying, it's a contractual breach. Money was on the line, so was credibility. In 2014, the NFL passed what became known as the Jimmy Graham rule: no more dunking on the goalpost. Do it, and you get a 15-yard penalty and a hefty fine. Graham himself was fined $30,000 in a preseason game that year for continuing to break the rule. It didn't matter that the crowd loved it. The risk was too high. This wasn't about dampening celebration. It was about preserving structure, both physical and financial. Graham had turned a lighthearted moment into a disruptive force. The NFL, a league that markets emotion but depends on precision, couldn't allow it to continue. What's left is a curious legacy, a beloved move banned not for danger, but for the inconvenience it posed to the machinery behind the game. The entertainment had crossed wires with the industry, so we ask, at what point does expression become interference? And when joy threatens the gears of a well-oiled system, do we protect the structure or the spirit of the game? It started with curiosity, a quiet hobby. A metal detector sweeping gently over the earth, searching for something long forgotten. For years in Richland, Washington, local enthusiasts scoured the public parks, respectfully, cautiously, hoping for a lost coin or a Civil War button. They weren't treasure hunters, they were memory seekers. Richland is no ordinary town. It sits beside the Columbia River, land once sacred to the Wanapum, Yakama, and Umatilla tribes. It's also near the Hanford site, a former nuclear production facility from the Manhattan Project. The soil beneath the parks holds layers of history, some sacred, some scientific, all fragile. For a long time, there was trust. The local metal detecting club worked with the city. There were rules, boundaries, mutual respect. Then came one man who didn't believe in rules. He's unnamed in the city's reports, but his actions were unmistakable. Massive holes dug under protected trees, shovels slicing through historical markers. And worst of all, a sacred site, a possible Native American burial ground, disturbed in his pursuit of personal discovery. He didn't call authorities, he didn't pause. He kept digging. When caught, the damage was already done. Artifacts destroyed, cultural heritage mangled. The city was left with an impossible decision: allow one man's recklessness to continue, or shut down a quiet, respectful community of hobbyists altogether. They chose the latter. A sweeping ban was passed. All metal detecting in city parks gone. A pastime erased because one person mistook public land for private conquest. For the others, it was more than disappointing. It was heartbreaking. Years of careful cooperation dissolved overnight. The respectful majority punished for the carelessness of one. The landscape of trust had been torn. This story isn't just about holes in the ground. It's about the cost of assuming good faith in a world that sometimes forgets the weight of history. So here's the reflection. How do we balance access with protection? When one person disrespects the past, do we close the door for everyone or try again, knowing the risk? It wasn't war or sabotage or even malice. It was a storm, and one man's passion for exotic animals. In August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into southern Florida with Category 5 fury. It shredded buildings, twisted steel, and erased entire neighborhoods. But among the devastation, something silent and almost invisible occurred. A cage broke open, and through that cage, the future slithered out. The facility was called Quira Specialties, run by a breeder known as Professor Burt. This wasn't a hobbyist's pet shop. It was a massive breeding ground for exotic reptiles, including one species particularly suited to Florida's lush environment, the Burmese python. When the storm tore through, the facility was destroyed. Dozens, maybe hundreds of snakes escaped into the Everglades. It was a small crack in an ecosystem that had balanced itself over millennia, and it would never be the same. Burmese pythons are not native to Florida, but they adapted with terrifying ease. No natural predators, ample food, a perfect climate. What began as a scattered presence grew into a population explosion. Today, estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 Burmese pythons slithering through the wetlands. They eat everything: raccoons, foxes, bobcats, birds, even deer and alligators. Mammal populations in the Everglades have plummeted by over 90%. The impact is irreversible. Entire food chains disrupted. Generations of native wildlife decimated. And it all leads back to one storm and one man's business. In 2021, nearly 30 years later, Florida officially banned the sale, breeding, and personal possession of Burmese pythons and other invasive reptiles. But the damage was already deep. The Everglades had changed, not just in population, but in purpose, from a sanctuary to a battlefield. Now, bounty programs and eradication efforts fight an uphill war. Hunters are trained, eggs are collected, but the snakes are winning. This is not just an environmental story. It's a lesson in unintended consequences. A single point of failure, amplified by nature's chaos, can ripple out across decades. So we ask, when do our private passions become public hazards? And in the face of irreversible change, what does responsibility look like after the damage is done? The field was clean. The ball spiraled through the air, and Lester Hayes was waiting. He wasn't just a great cornerback. He was a wall. In the early 1980s, Hayes was one of the most feared defenders in the NFL. But his true weapon wasn't speed or strength. It was stickiness. Hayes coated his hands in a substance called stickum, a sticky adhesive originally intended to help grip the ball. But he didn't stop there. He slathered it on his arms, his jersey, even his socks. He called it his gooey chewy. To opponents, he was human flypaper. Any ball that came close didn't just get intercepted, it got absorbed. Hayes' 1980 season was legendary. 13 interceptions, Defensive Player of the Year, and a Super Bowl win. The secret was no longer a secret, but it wasn't just about interceptions. Once he had the ball, it was nearly impossible to strip it away. Officials had to swap out footballs mid-game because they were so gummed up with residue. Teammates would give him fresh jerseys at halftime. The spectacle crossed from talent into absurdity. The league took notice. Stickum had been legal, but Hayes turned it into an unfair advantage. In 1981, the NFL passed what became known as the Lester-Hayes Rule. All adhesive substances were banned. What had once been an edge became a liability. Hayes's interceptions dropped sharply the following season, from 13 to 4. But the story didn't end there. In trying to ban the glue, the league ignited innovation. The modern receiver glove, a high-tech, tacky, yet legal alternative, was born in Stickum's absence. An entire industry emerged, offering grip without goo. The rule shaped the gear, and the gear reshaped the game. What began as one man's sticky obsession ended up influencing how every wide receiver, cornerback, and quarterback interacts with the ball. So here's the reflection. Where's the line between strategy and sabotage? When does innovation become exploitation? And when we rewrite the rules to restore fairness, are we just starting the next evolution of the game? The story of a global epidemic often searches for a face, a name, someone to blame. In the early days of the AIDS crisis in North America, that face became Gaëtan Dugas, a French-Canadian flight attendant posthumously labeled Patient Zero. He wasn't a villain, but for decades, that's how he was portrayed. In 1987, the best-selling book, And the Band Played On, painted Dugas as the central hub in a terrifying web of infection. A man who, the story claimed, knowingly spread the virus, flying from city to city, seducing, infecting, denying. The media devoured the narrative. Patient Zero was born, and with him, a myth that would misinform a generation. But it was never true. The entire label began with a typo. In early cluster studies by the CDC, Dugas was listed as Patient O, the letter O, shorthand for out of California. Someone, somewhere, mistook the O for a zero. That small misread became a legend. And that legend turned a man into a scapegoat. Dugas had, in fact, helped. He cooperated with researchers, provided names of partners, and mapped the earliest known network of infections. He wasn't the beginning. He was part of the middle. It would take until 2016, over 3 decades later, for genetic sequencing to clear his name. Archived blood samples proved the virus had been in the U.S. since at least 1970, years before Dugas was sexually active. He wasn't the origin. He wasn't even close. But by then the damage had been done. His name was etched into history's wrong version of the story. His family bore the shame. The world had already accepted a villain. This was a different kind of ban. Not a policy, not a law, a social ban. A man cast out in memory, posthumously condemned by misunderstanding. There's something haunting in that, a reminder of how easily a single error can bend the shape of public perception, how a myth can run faster than fact. So here's the reflection. In our rush to understand, to assign meaning or blame, how often do we trade accuracy for narrative? And once that story takes hold, who gets to rewrite it? She was known only as Mary, a cook, a woman who made peach ice cream and roasted meats for New York's wealthy families in the early 1900s. She left behind no memoirs, no letters, only hospital records and a trail of sickness that stretched across the city like a ghost. Mary Mallon was healthy, always had been. She didn't believe in germs. Many didn't. But wherever she worked, typhoid followed. In one home, a child fell ill. In another, a maid died. And then another outbreak. And another. The families changed, but the illness didn't. Public health investigator George Soper followed the trail like a detective. And all the paths pointed back to the same person, the cook. When confronted, Mary was furious. She refused to give samples, chased Soper away with a carving fork. The idea that she could be sick while feeling fine was, to her, madness. The city didn't agree. Mary was forcibly taken into custody and sent to North Brother Island, an isolated quarantine facility. She became the first known asymptomatic carrier of Salmonella typhi in the United States. And she was a problem no one had prepared for. After 3 years, she was released under one condition: never cook again. She promised, but the pay as a laundress was poor, and her pride remained. So she changed her name, Mary Brown, and found work in kitchens again. Then came the outbreak at Sloan Hospital for Women. 25 infected, 2 dead. The cook? Mary Brown. This time there was no second chance. She was sent back to North Brother Island, where she remained for the rest of her life, 23 years in forced isolation. She became a symbol, a warning, a headline. Typhoid Mary. The name outlived her. It became shorthand for invisible danger, for the idea that a person could walk among others and bring death without knowing. But Mary's legacy also reshaped the legal landscape. Her case laid the foundation for modern public health law. For the first time, the state asserted its right to isolate a healthy person in the interest of the greater good. Her defiance became the fulcrum for a new kind of power. So here's the reflection. How do we balance individual rights against communal safety? When a person carries danger within them, even unknowingly, who decides their freedom? And for how long? It was just an email. One message, sent on a quiet spring morning in 1978. But it didn't go to one person. It went to nearly everyone. The Internet then was not what we know today. It was ARPANET, a small, elite network connecting military researchers and academics, less than 400 people in total. It was built on trust, collaboration, and a shared purpose, until Gary Thwerk logged on. Thwerk was a marketing manager for Digital Equipment Corporation. He had a new product and a bright idea. Instead of calling potential clients or mailing invitations, why not use ARPANET to promote a demo? So he asked his assistant to send one unsolicited email to 393 addresses. The Internet's first spam had arrived. The reaction was immediate and scathing. ARPANET administrators condemned the message. Scientists were furious. The Defense Communications Agency, overseeing the network, called it a misuse of a shared resource. The backlash was total. But Thwerk wasn't discouraged. He later boasted that the campaign generated $13 million in sales. The message had worked. And the door, once cracked open, was impossible to shut. Today, over 300 billion spam emails are sent every single day. An entire cybersecurity industry exists to manage the fallout from that one moment. Spam filters, phishing protocols, antivirus software, all downstream from a single email that broke an unspoken rule. Thwerk's message didn't carry malware. It didn't steal data. It simply invaded a space where intrusion had never existed before. That was enough. It's strange to think of such a quiet beginning. No grand hack, no system breach, just one man choosing convenience over etiquette. And yet the impact is everywhere. Every junk folder, every CAPTCHA, every fleeting hope that maybe, just maybe, this one message is real. So here's the reflection. In a connected world, how much noise are we willing to tolerate for the sake of reach? And when the cost of speaking to everyone is being heard by no one, what have we really gained? It was a summer night in Texas, 2013. A 16-year-old named Ethan Couch stole beer from a Walmart, packed 7 friends into his father's oversized pickup, and drove recklessly down a dark road. He was drunk, 3 times the legal limit for an adult, with Valium in his system. At 70 miles per hour in a 40 zone, he veered off the road and struck a group of Good Samaritans helping a stranded vehicle. 4 people died. It was a tragic open and shut case of vehicular manslaughter. The facts weren't in dispute. The prosecution sought 20 years in prison, but the defense had another strategy. Enter the word affluenza. A psychologist hired by the defense argued that Couch was a victim, not of trauma, but of privilege. His wealthy, permissive parents had raised him without discipline. He had never learned that actions had consequences. He didn't know right from wrong, the argument went, because he'd never had to. He was too rich to be responsible. The judge agreed. Instead of prison, Couch was sentenced to 10 years of probation and a stay at a luxury rehabilitation center. No jail time, no real punishment. The nation erupted. Affluenza became a cultural lightning rod. Talk shows mocked it. Op-eds dissected it. For many, it confirmed what they feared, that justice had 2 lanes, one for the rich and one for everyone else. Lawmakers in Texas, stung by the backlash, moved quickly. They passed stricter sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders. Future cases would have a higher bar for probation. The leniency given to Couch effectively banned such leniency going forward. Years later, when Couch violated his probation and fled to Mexico, the public anger only deepened. He wasn't just a spoiled teen anymore. He was the face of a broken system. And yet, the story isn't just about Ethan Couch. It's about a legal and cultural moment when the notion of consequence bent under the weight of wealth. When a term meant to explain became a symbol of everything people feared about inequality. So here's the question: can privilege itself be a kind of blindness? And when our systems excuse the powerful instead of confronting them, who really pays the price?